Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Carmen Iannarelli, and in this particular video, we're going to talk about intersectionality and its connection to implicit bias, which will be a good way to introduce these concepts as we move on to the information in this module. First of all, since everyone is at a different point in their learning, let me briefly explain what intersectionality is before we go on to connecting it to implicit bias and other forms of oppression. Intersectionality is a metaphor for understanding the ways in which multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves to create obstacles that are often not understood in more conventional ways. This term has been rooted initially in Black feminism and originally was coined by American critical legal race scholar Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in 1989. She used this term, intersectionality, to refer to the double disadvantage of racism and sexism that many Black women faced. And using that particular concept has been used to refer to other groups and all the multitude of different statuses that people occupy at the same time, and how it creates these additional obstacles. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to take a look at some of these other identities and how this all can be interconnected with intersectionality. In talking about intersectionality, it's important to understand what we're really talking about here. So I have a little math equation for us as a way to think about it. So first of all, we have to talk about social identities. What are social identities? Social identities or social positions, sometimes sociologists also refer to them as social statuses. They are recognized statuses within a society. So for example, it could be race, it could be gender, and so on and so forth. Those are social identities. And when people occupy many different social identities at any one time, now you take social identities and they interact in social contexts. And the social contexts we're going to talk about here, specifically in the field of education, are systems of power. So systems of powers or structures of powers can be things along the lines of like our legal system, policies, healthcare, the government, and education. Now, if you take social identities and you put them within systems of power, then they contribute to what we would consider to be structural inequalities, which is the recognition that there is an outcome in the reality that people live, and it reflects a combination of different social identities that they occupy. Some social identities will have privilege attached to them, and other social identities will have marginalization or attached to them. And the overall outcome of the social identities plus the system of powers results in the structural inequalities and brings fully to mind the concept of intersectionality. So this is how you can have people that share one or two social identities still have fundamentally different experiences with systems of power and therefore different structural inequalities as a result because of the other social identities that they occupy. The relationship, as we take a look here, is really interconnected that way. So now that we've covered the very brief overview of what intersectionality is, let's talk about it and how it is connected to oppression. So there are multiple different definitions of oppression, and you probably have your own definition within your head. So our first definition we are going to take a look at here is just basically a dictionary definition of oppression, which is the unjust or cruel exercise of authority or power. Another definition of oppression is the force that allows, through the power of norms and systems, unjust treatment or control. I do have a preference for this particular definition, although the other one is perfectly fine. This has more of a social science lens to it. And we will spend a bunch of time, as we already have through the component of this course, is thinking about systems. And when we think about education, I always like to remind people that education is a system. It's a system and a social structure that has been created within our society. And it has significant impacts, positive and negative in both cases, to individuals that engage in it, which is, most people in the United States. So now let's further connect intersectionality and oppression, which I started doing in the previous slide here. But we have to think about how oppression is dependent and shaped by social identities. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that our social identities are fluid. There are some that are fixed and there's others that are fluid. The social identities that you occupy today have not always been the social identities that you've occupied. Some may be the same, but others will be different. Additionally, the social structures that you are in will influence how your social identities affect you. Now, give that some thought, and it'll make more sense here in a few minutes. Let's talk about social identities. Now, depending on how many social science classes you have taken, specifically probably sociology being one of the main ones, social identities and how we're using the term are social characteristics that broadly define people and hold meaning and expectations within a society. So keeping in mind here, social identities will be different depending on the society that you are part of. Social identities can be grouped into a number of different categories, but two very important ones are what we call ascribed identities and achieved identities. Ascribed identities are aspects that are given to people and there is no control in them, and they are usually occur at birth or are involuntarily entered. So different components like race or ethnicity, you can take a look at gender, sexuality, and you can also take a look at how disabilities fit into this. Whereas achieved social identities or achieved social statuses are aspects of an identity that are chosen or achieved by an individual. So someone has done something to receive this social identity. Whether that's positive or whether that's negative, it doesn't make any difference. So it could be a family role or a relationship. It also could be nationality or citizenship if you naturalized in a country or if you immigrated to a country as well. Now, if you were born in a particular country, that would usually be ascribed. Achieved would be if you immigrated. Hopefully that makes sense. The same is true also with religion, I'd like to mention. So some people are born into a religious group, making it ascribed in childhood, and other people choose to develop a religious identity, and then it becomes an achieved status. I understand that can be a little bit complicated, but there are a few that can go either way. Taking a more robust look at social identities, although this is still not inclusive of all social identities. Here I have a wheel for you. And in this particular wheel, which will be different from society to society, I have outlined here a number of different social identities. Hopefully you can use the information we just covered about achieved and ascribed and see how some of these identities are achieved and some of them are ascribed. Additionally, you see the identities that are on top are identities that within U.S. culture tend to have power or privilege associated with them. And the identities on the lower section of the circle have been marginalized or minoritized over time. And you can take a look at how they mirror each other, and hopefully that allows you to kind of take a look here and pause and think about some of the identities that you occupy. And what most people will find is if they take a look at this particular wheel, they will understand that they occupy different social identities that have power attached to them and other social identities that have been marginalized. So let's take a moment here to think about ourselves and to pause. So when we do that, let's think about intersectionality now that we've introduced the concept. I know many of you are already familiar with this concept before I introduced it, but as we take a look at it here, I would challenge you to pause and think about some of these questions. How often do you think about intersectionality and those different social identities that you occupy? And when do you think about it? What causes you to think about it? And why? Is it in a particular environment? Is it when you are at work? Is it when you are at school? Is it in your personal life? And if you don't think about intersectionality, maybe consider the why behind that. And if you pause now and you think about the different social identities that you occupy, how does understanding intersectionality or thinking about intersectionality alter how you view yourself? Give those questions some time to pause, think about, and reflect. Now, let's talk about implicit bias, which refers to the unconscious attitudes, prejudice, or judgments about people or groups of people, attached again to those social identities. So when we think about implicit bias, the first thing I want to highlight here is implicit bias is unconscious for most people. Implicit bias can be conscious, but for most people, it is unconscious and involuntary. It happens through years of socialization and exposure to different groups. Everyone has some form of an implicit bias, and implicit bias can influence our behaviors, our decisions, and our actions towards others, even without conscious awareness. So thinking back on social identities and social statuses, maybe you have experienced implicit bias directed at you because of a social identity you occupy. Also, we need to be mindful of the implicit biases that we have and how they affect how we treat other groups of people. Now, I know we can be very quick to say that we don't hold these beliefs, but everyone holds some implicit bias, and they can manifest in different ways. So we're going to do some challenging aspects here of, could it be about race, age, socioeconomic status, other cultural biases? But also, what about biases that people have, conscious or unconscious about it, targeted or directed at people with disabilities? I would like to take a minute to introduce Erving Goffman's framework of social identities as we think about implicit bias. Implicit bias, of course, again, as I mentioned, is not necessarily intentional, and it can be unconscious. And it forms over socialization of years and years and years, experiences that we've all had. Erving Goffman used the framework of the discredited versus the discreditable in talking about how social identities impact people differently. So let's take a look at this framework quickly. Erving Goffman said that social identities could be grouped largely as being part of the discredited versus the discreditable. A discredited social identity is a social identity that is predominantly visual to others. Now, thinking about this, it doesn't necessarily mean that people have to be correct in identifying the social identity. They could even be wrong. So, for example, you could be part of a racial group that has been minoritized, and someone may identify you as part of that group, and you might not be part of it. They may have identified your race incorrectly. But irregardless, it still could affect how you are being treated. So when we think about discredited statuses, we're thinking about statuses that tend to be predominantly visual to other people. A discreditable status is an identity that is predominantly concealable to others. Now, I am not suggesting that people should have to conceal a social identity. However, people sometimes do conceal identities because they've learned that that identity is stigmatized within our society. Now, it also could be trying to limit their negative exposure towards implicit bias within different social systems that way. Now, when we think about discreditable statuses, we can think about components, for example, of gender. If someone is non-binary, we can also think about sexuality. Additionally, we can think about how various religious identities could be part of this group as well. We could also take a look at how social class could be connected to this, but I think we would definitely need to spend some time taking a look at how discredited and discreditable social statuses specifically apply to people with disabilities. We'll do that next. Although what I have laid out here is definitely not an absolute, but I've taken some time to take a look at disability identities and how they could be part of either the discredited or the discreditable. And I have that laid out here for you. And again, it is not an absolute that way. But I challenge you to spend some time, take a look at this slide, and to think about your experiences with students and other life experiences as well, and how certain types of disabilities are not as outwardly present to everyone. Additionally, I would challenge you to think about the efforts you may have yourself other people in your life or your students have gone through to conceal different types of disabilities that they have. Additionally, I think it's important to mention that people that are part of discreditable identities are more likely to have to prove their identity. And I would challenge you to think about how that works within the framework of people with disabilities. And we think about the additional types of paperwork and documentation that is required from systems of education to quote unquote prove that someone has a disability, especially if that disability is not outwardly present. So let's think about ourselves for a second here. I think it's always good to reflect. So I want you to think about the social identities that you occupy and which ones you're most aware of. And as you think about those wheels and all those different social identities, consider the ones that you're least aware of for yourself. But next, I want you to dive deeper here. I want you to think about how you learn the social identities of your students. Maybe thinking back even to some of the information that we have learned in the previous modules. Additionally, how are social identities tracked within your classrooms or within your schools? And take a moment and pause and reflect if you've ever placed different values attached to different social identities, whether it is with your students or within other experiences in your life. Since many of you work at all different levels of education, I want to just offer up this timeline of life transitions. And I want us to kind of think about how implicit bias is experienced by students throughout these life transitions and how social identities are experienced throughout these life transitions. So we think about early education and we can think about preschool or 4K and basically just those early years. And let's think about how students at this point might be aware of different social identities that they occupy. And they're already starting to have experiences with implicit bias, and especially within different structures of how they're treated. Then, depending on what your school looks like, you have another transition, and it's those middle school years. And during this particular time, maybe some individuals become aware of a social identity or become their social identity becomes labeled, and they also start to become aware of implicit bias or the bias that they've or the treatment they've seen other people experience, other students their age, and how that is connected to oppression even if they're not using that language. And then we can think about our education systems and that transition into high school, which could be a new school and a new environment. And again, how these social identities can be experienced that way. Additionally, as people age, they also do not just experience their social identities, of course, at school. They're now going to have all these different experiences within communities, within friendships, and other interpersonal relationships. And then let's talk about adulthood. I see this happen so often with my college students, especially my college students that have disabilities. And as they frequently enter into, post-high school experiences, do not want to use a lot of the resources and the accommodation plans that they had when they were in our K-12 systems, probably because they are very aware of the social stigma that can be attached to it. Or I also witness it with students not wanting to disclose if they have a disability because they're going to try to work their way through it without using resources. Again, highlighting the difference between the discredited and the discreditable identities that way. Additionally, people navigate as they transition into life and other relationships. You will see this on a personal level as well too, where you will watch people that do not want to disclose, especially discreditable statuses, because they're concerned, whether consciously or unconsciously, about the implicit bias or potentially the negative associations with those identities. As we close out this lecture here, I want us to think about some information. I want us to consider some reflection questions here. So first of all, how has this information helped you better understand your students, or how could it? How can you assist in reducing stigma and oppression for your students while still getting to know them, and being aware of their social identities? How can you also incorporate identity reflection into conversations about student success and student experiences and student challenges within your schools? And how can you actively work to create these liberating environments where you're mindful of potential implicit bias that you have, and and others around you, to create the best learning experience for all students?